The movie kicks off with the story of John Falcon Chapman, who used to be a Marine in the US. He's been through some tough times in the war, and it left him with a condition called post-traumatic stress disorder, which makes him feel really messed up inside because he lost all his buddies in the battle. Because of this, he sometimes does this really dangerous thing called Russian roulette, where you put a gun to your head and pull the trigger. But every time he tries it, the gun doesn't go off and he doesn't die. One day, while Chapman was hanging out at a store, two guys walked in and tried to rob the place. But Chapman wasn't scared at all. Instead, he told them not to aim their guns at people's stomachs, cause that's how you keep them alive. He got real brave and turned the gun towards his own head. The robbers got all confused by what he was doing. That's when Chapman used the end of his gun to knock one of the robbers out cold. Then he did the same to the other guy, and they both passed out. The next day, while Chapman was chilling at home, his sister Cindy dropped by. She was there because she was going to a wedding in Chapman's hometown. After that, she was planning to go back to Brazil to work as an activist, helping out with important stuff in a non-profit group. But after Cindy went back to Brazil, Chapman got some really bad news. They said Cindy was found by the beach, all messed up with really bad injuries all over her body. Chapman wasted no time and hopped on a plane to Brazil to check on his sister. Over in Brazil, there's this detective named Thiago Santo, and he's teamed up with his partner Carlo Bororo. They're in a neighborhood in the favela to nab some folks they think are smuggling illegal guns. While they were making the arrests, a policewoman named Catarina showed up and told Santo he was stepping into her turf. And the way Santo was treating the folks there, it wasn't cool at all. Now things got tense when Santo started intimidating Catarina, and one of the local kids got fed up and threw a rock at Santo's back. Santo didn't take that lightly, and he pulled out his gun, pointing it at the kid. Then, all the young people there pulled out their own guns, aiming them at Santo. It was getting real dangerous real quick. To keep things from getting worse, Santo decided to play it smart. He lowered his gun and challenged one of the young guys to a fight. He made a deal with them. If he lost, he and his crew wouldn't bother them anymore. The folks in the favela agreed to Santo's challenge. First up, Bororo stepped in to fight one of the gang members. Bororo was really good at capoeira, and he took down the gangster with just a few kicks. When his partner won, Santo yelled out that one day they'd be back, but the local kids just looked at him with a smirk, like they weren't buying it. So Chapman made it to Brazil, and a fellow veteran and diplomat named Manny Ridley gave him a ride. As soon as he got there, he went straight to see Cindy, who was in the intensive care room. He was shocked to see how bad she looked. It brought back memories of all the suffering he'd seen during his time in the war. At the hospital, Ridley introduced Chapman to Santo, the guy in charge of Cindy's assault case. Ridley tried to convince Chapman to chill out and let Santo handle things, but Chapman wasn't having it. He really wanted to be part of the investigation. He asked Santo to take him to the place where they found Cindy. When they got there, they met Catarina. Chapman was quick on the draw and grabbed the gun she had hidden in her waistband, pointing it at a car. He heard a noise like an explosion coming from the car's exhaust. Santo saw how fast Chapman reacted and realized this guy was no ordinary dude. He told Catarina to keep an eye on him. After that, Catarina gave Chapman a tour of the favela and told him about the folks living there. She explained that some of the public stuff, like clinics, schools, and government offices, were actually funded by illegal businesses. The people had to do this because the government never really helped them out. It put Catarina in a tough spot because, as a law enforcement officer, catching drug dealers, smugglers, and crooks meant causing trouble for the folks in the favela. Once she showed Chapman around, Catarina left him by the beach. Chapman, being curious, went back to the place where Cindy was found and kept an eye on things. He saw a group of shady-looking young people from a distance and decided to follow them. And you won't believe what he saw. Cindy's necklace was wrapped around the neck of one of the guys named Kuka. Chapman asked Kuka where the necklace came from, but Kuka couldn't speak English, so he didn't answer. Instead, he kind of gestured at Chapman, like he wanted to challenge him to a fight. A big fight was about to go down. Chapman was surrounded by a bunch of young guys. He didn't have any weapons, just his bare hands, but he started taking them on one by one. Even when Kuka tried to attack him with a knife, Chapman managed to break his attack and grabbed the knife away. Then he pointed it right back at Kuka. Out of nowhere, Catarina showed up with a gun, and that made Chapman lower the knife he had on Kuka's neck. Katerina translated what Kuka was saying and told Chapman that Kuka was one of Cindy's pals. Kuka showed them a photo of his sister with Cindy and explained that Cindy had given the necklace directly to his little sister. But here's the kicker. His little sister had vanished before they found Cindy all beat up on the beach. So it seemed like the same person who hurt Cindy had taken Kuka's sister too. Before Chapman left, Kuka gave him a notebook that belonged to Cindy, and it was something she had given to his sister. Kuka was hoping that the notebook might have some clues to find the bad guy. So in the afternoon, Chapman used some carbon paper to check out the notebook, and he found a phone number for a photographer who had been working with Cindy lately. The next day, Chapman met up with the photographer at a cafe and started asking him questions. The photographer spilled the beans that Cindy was looking into some serious stuff, like a conspiracy about human trafficking. But when Chapman asked for proof of what happened to Cindy, the photographer refused to give it up. So, as they said their goodbyes, Chapman slyly swiped the photographer's flash drive. But when the photographer got in his car, it suddenly blew up. Poor guy didn't make it. And if that wasn't bad enough, a car pulled up in front of a cafe, and the people inside started shooting at Chapman. Luckily, he managed to dodge the bullets. He grabbed a gun from one of the attackers and fired back, hitting them with some really precise shots, which made them take off in a hurry. Not too long after that, Chapman was in Ridley's office, going through the photos on the flash drive he swiped from the photographer. These photos showed Cindy hanging out with some guy at a nightclub, and it seemed like that had something to do with what happened to her. When Ridley saw the name of the nightclub, it rang a bell for him. He remembered there was this group of Yakuza folks who'd been living in Brazil for like 30 years. Those Yakuza were really bad news, always up to no good, especially when it came to kidnapping kids. It seemed like Cindy might have found out about them and started her own investigation. When they caught wind of what she was up to, they decided to teach her a lesson. That night, Chapman went to that nightclub and tracked down the guy he was after. He followed the guy into the restroom and gave him a good scare, dunking his head in the toilet. After that, the guy couldn't take it anymore and spilled the beans, giving Chapman the address of the person who had hurt Cindy. The next day, Chapman, with Ridley by his side, went to that address to find some answers. Over in another part of town, Santo and his fellow cops were getting ready for a big raid in a residential area of the favela to nab some drug dealers. They went in all guns blazing, not caring who they were shooting at. Any young folks who tried to run away got shot down without any warning. It was a real mess, and they ended up killing all those young people in the surprise attack. One of Santo's guys was still poking around the neighborhood, and he happened to spot some Japanese guys in fancy black suits carrying some kids. That raised some red flags for him, so he arrested one of the Japanese men. A little while later, Santo showed up. But Santo didn't waste any time. He killed his own guy and let the Japanese man go free, no questions asked. Turns out, Santo was a dirty cop in cahoots with the Yakuza, letting them do their criminal stuff without any interference. And to make things even worse, Santo tried to blame the young folks in the favela for all the bad stuff the Yakuza were up to. Meanwhile, Chapman had reached his destination and told Ridley to head home because he wanted to check things out on his own. Little did he know that he had walked right into the Yakuza's turf. But he didn't back down, and he boldly took on the Yakuza he encountered. He even managed to beat them up. Before long, though, Chapman found himself surrounded by 3 more Yakuza members, and they all got into a fight with just their fists. All the ruckus caught the attention of one of the Yakuza guards at the headquarters, and he quickly called his boss, Hiramoto, who was the big shot in charge of the Yakuza. Over somewhere else, Hiramoto, who was bald, was sitting in a big courtyard. He had just finished a phone call and went over to meet a guest. One of his men brought him a long box that had a sword inside. With a calm and emotionless face, Hiramoto strolled over to the guy Chapman had met at the nightclub. In one swift move, he stabbed the poor guy right in the stomach, and that was it. The guy was gone in an instant. Chapman was still in the middle of a fight at the Yakuza's place. Out of the blue, Santo and Bororo aimed their guns at him and told him to stop going after the Yakuza. Chapman opened up a briefcase full of documents that proved the Yakuza's involvement in human trafficking. Santo asked for Mr. Lima's briefcase. Outside the Yakuza headquarters, Katerina showed up to pick up Chapman. As they were getting ready to leave, Chapman noticed something fishy. Santo had mentioned Mr. Lima's name, but Chapman hadn't talked about Mr. Lima before. That got Chapman thinking that Santo might be in cahoots with the Yakuza. So Chapman turned the tables and sneaked into Santo's car. Turns out Santo was driving away from the Yakuza's place, heading toward a dock. Chapman managed to slip out of Santo's car and hid nearby, keeping an eye on what Santo was up to from a distance. At the pier, Santo went to a warehouse where the Yakuza were hiding the kidnapped kids. Chapman called Ridley for help to put a stop to this child smuggling operation. But he got impatient waiting for Ridley and the police, so he decided to go in alone. Chapman sneaked around and took down several Yakuza members one by one, leaving them immobilized. Then he crossed paths with Bororo, who tried to use his capoeira moves on Chapman, but it didn't work out for him. Chapman landed a heavy punch, and Bororo hit the ground. Santo showed up too, but it turned out he wasn't much of a fighter. Chapman easily handled Santo's attacks. But then Bororo got back on his feet, and the two of them teamed up against Chapman. And if that wasn't enough, Hiramoto joined in with his samurai sword. But even with all of them against him, Chapman managed to take down Santo and Bororo with just his bare hands. Then Chapman went up against Hiramoto, who had a sword. Chapman grabbed 2 iron rods to fight him. Their fight didn't last long, and Chapman easily defeated Hiramoto. Hiramoto went down after getting hit with the iron rods. Shortly after, Ridley and the police arrived at the docks while Chapman worked on freeing the children. Towards the end of the movie, Chapman faces another challenge. Treating Cindy's internal injuries is going to cost a lot of money. Fortunately, Ridley is willing to help cover the cost of Cindy's treatment, but there's a condition. Chapman has to join the State Department as an agent using his old military nickname, Falcon. With no other options, Chapman agreed to the deal. And that's how the movie comes to a close. So the moral of the story is, if you ever find yourself in a tough spot, just remember, it's all fun in games until you bring a samurai sword to a fist fight.